Is mold making you sick? Could it be the cause of your mystery autoimmune disease? Well, it was for me, and some experts estimate that 20% of the population could be struggling with mold toxicity and not even realize it. I recently figured out that mold was the cause of my chronic illness that I've been struggling with for the past 4 years, and I'm currently on an extensive treatment plan to get better. If you're new here, I have a degree in science and I enjoy doing research on topics and reporting them. So, in this report, I'm going to go through my personal story, including how I figured out it was mold that was making me sick. You can find all of the resources and reference all my information on my blog. I'll put the link in my description.
Planet Me podcast.
This is the journey of setting yourself free.
So first, I'm going to go into my personal story. So my story starts in June 2020 when I moved into a small unit in Torquay, Australia, and that was built in the 70s, and there was no sign of mold in this house. Towards the end of the year, I started to develop some pretty significant health issues. I was bedridden with migraines. I had flu-like symptoms a lot of the time, and when I wasn't sick, when I would leave the house, I would get a flare-up of my symptoms and I would have to go home. So I stopped being able to work, exercise, go on holidays with my parents. I was constantly seeing doctors and specialists, constantly doing tests, which showed evidence of high inflammation. And the doctors told me that I had some kind of mystery autoimmune disease, but they didn't know what it was. So they diagnosed me with chronic fatigue. I was so scared during this time. I just felt like I was wasting my youth away. I had no idea what was wrong with me or how to get better. The doctors also really didn't know what was wrong with me, and sometimes I had to wait 6 months to see one. And this is the first time I saw the flaws in Australia's medical system. Even though I am grateful that it is better than other parts of the world, I still think it could be way better. The endocrinologist that I was seeing actually made a comment suggesting that I was lying about my fatigue and illnesses, but he was built like the man from the Minions, and I made a vow to myself that day that I would never take health advice again from someone who didn't look healthy. I also had a constant candida problem and I was always thirsty and felt dehydrated, even though I drank so much water. At this time, I also went through a very severe depression, like really, really, really bad. Like it was so bad that sometimes it would just like whomp me like the whomping willow, and I just like could not get up off the floor. I remember one day I was walking from the couch to the kitchen to put a plate back or something, and it just hit me, and I just had to lay down there on the kitchen floor. And I think I was laying there for about 45 minutes until I could just get back up and go to the couch. Like, that's how bad it was. It was really bad. I did have trauma that I hadn't dealt with, which I went to therapy for. But in hindsight, I honestly think that the mold amplified my depression like tenfold. I look back now and I'm like, imagine killing yourself over mold, but I 100% am sure that some people do. I had read before that depression can be a physiological problem rather than a mental one, and I didn't really believe that until I removed myself from the mold, and it dramatically improved my depression like immediately. This is also a key sign for me that I'm in a mold environment that I can't see. Another symptom of mine is really chronic insomnia, which I've had since I was 16. I know now that is a symptom of my autism, which I'm going to talk about later, but it was definitely worse in the mold environment, and that's another sign to me that I'm in a moldy environment. I also want to mention that during this stage of my health journey, medicinal cannabis is one of the only things that was helping me with my migraines and some of my other symptoms, which is why I advocate for it. So in June 2021, when I was 28 years old, I moved back in with my parents and I stayed there for 2 years. And I got a lot better in this time, but it was slow progression. And I also gained like 20 kilos in this time for no apparent reason. And this is a big sign of mold toxicity. So the mycotoxins will affect leptin, the hormone, which is the hormone responsible for your hunger cues. So this causes people to eat more than they normally would. And the toxins from mold are also fat soluble. So your body will often create more fat, so it has some place to store these toxins away from the system. Also, mold can wreak havoc to your hormones, and correcting this is actually one of the key steps in treatment according to the Shoemaker protocol. And this likely caused my PCOS. And to anyone who has PCOS knows that just how much that messes with your weight. During this time, I was still struggling with depression, even though I had made leaps and bounds. And at this time, I tried the Lion Diet, which was developed by Michaela Peterson, who, if you haven't listened to this by some miracle, please come on my podcast, even if it's just so I can thank you, because you've really pioneered a lot of the pathway towards my health and how I got better. And there's so many things I'd love to ask you, but even if you don't reach out and you happen to hear this, I'm just so grateful for what you've done, honestly. Um, yeah, so for those who don't know, the Lion Diet is the least allergy inducing diet. So it's basically the ultimate elimination diet. And so many people with autoimmune diseases have reported putting their conditions completely into remission on this diet. So it includes the meat of ruminant animals only. So for 6 weeks, I ate nothing but steak and lamb chops and salt. Nothing else, no oil, no spices, nothing. So I've literally done everything that I could to get better. And I'm going to do a report eventually on the Lion diet as well. So this diet had a dramatic impact on me. I lost 10 kilos. I felt a lot better for the first time in 5 years. My blood tests showed no signs of inflammation, which is interesting to me because I obviously still had mold in my system, but it just must have been reduced so much that it wasn't in crazy range anymore. However, I still had fatigue, insomnia, and some other symptoms that it didn't fix. Interestingly, a lot of people in the carnivore community now believe that they actually have a problem with mold, and the carnivore diet simply reduced their bucket of inflammation so much that it stopped overflowing, and this caused a cessation of their symptoms. So, Judy Cho, she talks about this, and she's someone in the scene who I really trust to evaluate and report the science, while keeping an open mind enough to continuously update her opinion when new evidence is presented. So, Judy, you're another person who would absolutely love to talk to you on the podcast. Really look up to you. And yeah, so if you haven't read this or see this, then yeah, feel free to send me a message. So in July 2023, I moved into a new home by myself. So the house was originally built in the 70s, but it was completely renovated and it had an extension put on for the master bedroom and ensuite where I slept. So this house looked beautiful and modern. Again, there was no sign of mold. And in October 2023, I was diagnosed with autism. And I learned that many of my symptoms are related to that. So the insomnia is common as autistic people are wired to a different circadian rhythm, as is depression and chronic fatigue. So I learned that a lot of my chronic fatigue is actually autistic burnout. And so it's really common for people who have autism to have burnout because for us to process one day takes a lot more energy than a quote unquote normal person, particularly when it involves social interactions. But there is definitely a difference between burnout and chronic fatigue for me. And I just want to take a quick second to explain the difference between them for me. The best way I can describe burnout is like having two batteries. There is one day-to-day battery and there is the reserve battery. So if I do too much in one day, then I take from the reserve battery. But if I don't give myself enough downtime, that reserve battery doesn't refill. And when it's empty, I burn out and it takes me a long time to recover it. Like I'm talking years. And some people never recover. The analogy that's given is that it's not just like you burn all the water from the kettle, you've actually burnt the kettle and now the kettle doesn't work well anymore, that being your body. So I just want to mention that because I just want to highlight that it's really important to not push autistic people to do things or have expectations on them that you would have on a normal person or a neurotypical person because you can do some really irreversible damage to them. Chronic fatigue, on the other hand, is different because it's more of an inflammatory response. It often comes with flu-like symptoms, including the migraines. So I know now that my chronic fatigue is mold related for me. So in 2024, a whole new set of symptoms arose that I've never had before. And a lot of them were really acute issues that in themselves weren't enough to make me go to the doctor, but I knew that something was wrong. It was confusing because in some ways I was getting better and in other ways I was getting worse. So I now know that different types of mold will give me different symptoms. So my old symptoms of fatigue were getting better and I could run again, but yet a whole host of new symptoms appeared. I started to develop arthritis during certain periods whenever I'd eat anything. So I did an IgG intolerance test and that told me that I was only intolerant to like 3 foods that I wasn't eating. So my naturopath later figured out that it was actually a histamine problem. It was foods that had high histamine and histamine is really closely associated with mold. Then I started to get acne that I've never had before. I had itchy ear canals, ringing in the ears, blurry vision sometimes. I once broke out in a full body rash. I would always get night sweats and I would wake up with aches and stiffness in my shoulders, even though I didn't work out the day before. I had constant flare-ups of eczema. I couldn't breathe through my nose in bed at night. My sinus was always blocked, so I became a mouth breather and it was very uncomfortable. Then I was diagnosed with PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. Basically, my hormones were just whack. So then I started to notice impaired brain function. So I kept losing my train of thought, couldn't think of the word that I wanted to use, and my memory was getting worse. And I thought it was because I smoked weed. But then I don't smoke that much weed, and that never used to happen when I smoked weed. So yeah, and this has since stopped completely since moving into the tent. So my insomnia was also shocking at this time. It was pretty common for me to go to bed at midnight and still be laying there wide awake at 8 a.m. So usually it takes me 3 to 4 hours to fall asleep on a good night, but not 8. This was next level. I was also having really bad bouts of depression, which was confusing because I was in remission for depression, but some days I would just have really strong suicidal ideation and I had no idea why because nothing was wrong. Then I started to develop a compromised immune system, and this was the breaking point for me. So I used to be the type of person who could get sick once a year, and then I started to get sick once every month. And by sick, I mean I caught whatever was going around and I was out for a week, like couldn't get out of the house for a week, like that level of sick. And then it started to be once every second week. So 1 week on, 1 week off, 1 week sick, 1 week not. And I was freaking out because I was like, I can't go back to being sick like this all the time. This is when I finally figured out that it was mold that was making me sick. I left the house, I moved into a tent in my parents' backyard, and almost all these symptoms have stopped dramatically since then. Okay, so how did I figure out that it was mold? So I couldn't see mold in any of my houses that I've lived in that have made me sick. But in the last house, I intuitively knew that it was something in the air that was causing my eczema because my symptoms were worse in some rooms and better than in others. I also knew that dust had caused my eczema in the past. And this is interesting because it turns out that dust is highly associated with mold as the mycotoxins attach to dust. And this explains why I always flare up when I go to op shops and places like that. So I bought an air purifier, but the purifier kept saying that the air was clean. So that was confusing. Then one day I opened Instagram for one of the first times since taking a long break from it. And the first thing I saw was a post from my friend Janelle about how she just realized that mold was making her family sick, and in particular her son who was in hospital. And I just want to say a quick thank you to Janelle because if you weren't open about your story, then I wouldn't have figured that out. So thank you. I can't explain it, but when I saw that post, it just went straight through me. And it was like something in me was saying pay attention. So this is when I started to think maybe it was mold. I was also aware that one of the walls in my bedroom underneath the window where I slept my head at night, that used to leak in really, really heavy rain. So for those who don't know, mold grows in water damaged buildings. So, if there's a flood or there's a leak, you have 24 to 48 hours to dry that space professionally with, professional dehumidifiers or else mold will grow. So then I started to put the pieces together. So I bought a moisture meter, but all the readings came back 0.0. But I probably bought the wrong one. There's some good ones and there's some shit ones. I'm going to make a recommendation for a good one in Australia in the how to test your home for mold section later. So all the evidence, the air purifier was saying that the air was clean. The moisture meter was saying 0.0. So I thought, I don't know if it can be mold if I can't see anything. Then a week later, I was meditating and I said to the universe, like I always do, please give me some guidance for my next few steps. And as soon as I said that, the image of Janelle's post, popped straight into my mind. And that shit doesn't happen to me. I'm not a psychic or whatever. But I don't know, something was so strongly saying to me mold. When I started going down the rabbit hole with mold toxicity, everything inside of me just went click, 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 click. And I just knew in my heart and soul that this is what was making me sick. However, I couldn't see any mold and I had no evidence, I hadn't done any tests or anything yet. So I was really, really scared that people weren't going to believe me. This is a big problem with people with mold toxicity is you can be really gaslit. A lot of people will treat you like you're paranoid or you're crazy because they can't see it and you don't have any evidence yet. And, everywhere you go, you can be like, is it mold? Is it mold? And you don't know. Then I looked very carefully on the walls in my house for mold and I couldn't see it. But then I finally spotted some in my ensuite. There were tiny spots that you couldn't see unless you were looking for it. And that was it. I was out. I took my cat to my parents' house and I never stayed in that house again. I moved into a tent in their backyard where I'm still living 3 months later. I told the real estate because I was renting, and by law, they have to send someone within 2 days to look at it. So they sent a mold inspector who tested several places, including the leaking wall where you couldn't see any mold, and they all came back positive. So they said they would send someone to fix it, but that it would take 3 weeks. And so I asked them on the phone several times, the real estate agent, I was just like, is this house safe for me to stay in or not? And they kept saying, we can't tell you that. And so I broke up with them. I was just like, well, fuck you then. I'm breaking the lease. According to BCAP, if you have mold in your house, you're allowed to leave or break the lease without there being any penalties, such as them taking your bond. So this is what I did. But they ended up fucking me over anyways by taking $1,000 out of my bond because of quote unquote dust on the light fittings, even though I sent them an invoice for a professional cleaner. So they just started doing petty shit like that. And it's don't worry about the thousands of dollars literally me and my family have spent on medical bills and having to throw out so much of my furniture, whatever. And I actually went through a phase where I was just so angry about all of that. And I don't know, there's just something about when a person disrespects you and gets away with it. And I thought I was going to come on here on my podcast and name and shame them. And I wouldn't even be against people who do that. But for me, I went through a bit of a stage of processing resentment. And I'm actually going to do another podcast about that in the future. But so I've decided not to do that. So after that, I started to focus on getting better. I researched and I found 2 specialist doctors in Australia, highly regarded, including Dr. Kate Barry, who will be in a future podcast episode. And Dr. Barry referred me to get a whole heap of tests done, and the results did indeed confirm that I had mold toxicity. I will go into more detail about that below. I've also been taking prescription medication and I have noticed improvements. But because all of this was costing my family so much money, I decided to move to Dr. Anjana's clinic just because she works closely with a naturopath, Adrian Harper. And so I see a combination of both of them, and this helps to keep the costs down a lot. I will say that the process of getting better can be really hard because a lot of doctors don't know anything about it. And so many of them will just dismiss it completely and call it woo woo. If you're in Geelong, I really recommend Dr. James Webster at Myer Street Medical. Even though he's not a specialist in mold, he's just supportive and he's open minded. And so he's someone that I'm really grateful I had on my team during this time. But the best thing that you can do is go to a specialist doctor because one, they will understand, two, they will validate how you're feeling, and yeah, three, they'll put you on the right path.